All right. Does a soul exist? Are there any good arguments for consciousness? What is reality? Is reality what we can test and measure? Is it fundamentally different than what we thought before? Those are some of the questions we're going to dive in. And I have with me Corie, all the way from the Caribbean. Someone said that's not too
Right.
far, but that's pretty far for me. Someone on Facebook said that. But Corie, thanks for coming on. You,
Thanks
you
for having
you
me.
had mentioned that you I think for 5 years you said you've been watching some of my content videos and you've been wanting to have an online discussion with me. So welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks a lot. So I'm from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. Apart from doing philosophy and having these debates, I'm also an accountant for a construction company. I have two kids. I'm 37 years old, and yeah, I'm passionate about philosophy. I don't have any academic credentials, but I have a strong passion for the subject, and I've had multiple debates with um, a lot of apologetics. So yeah, that's basically me in a nutshell. And looking forward to get started. Also, I guess I just want to clarify that. So I am a non-theist. That means I don't identify as an atheist. I'm a theological non-cognitivist, and by theological non-cognitivism, I am of the view that religious language, or specifically in the Abrahamic religion, the concept of God is either not meaningful or incoherent. So statements like God exists is not meaningful to me. So I see the atheist position as a propositional attitude or psychological state in relation to a coherent concept. And I don't believe the concept of God is coherent. So I guess we'll be discussing meaning, how we fix meaning, and whether the conditions for an existence can be satisfied under what you call a soul.
Okay, so you said lot to unpack there. You said you think the notion of God is incoherent. Is that right? Why is that?
So the reason I think that is because I believe the non-spatial is the negation of all meaningful referencing. I don't consider the concept of the non-spatial to be meaningful because I view it as the logical negation of all meaningful reference in itself. So I would consider all referencing to be a spatial activity. What I mean by that is that it is the activity of something spatial. So in a weak sense, I would consider an activity a spatial activity because it is what space does. And I don't use space in the operational sense within traditional contemporary physics. The definition I have for space is not only functional, but it is also ostensive, which means that anything that you could be referable to within experience that you could identify would qualify as space, and um, and cognition will be considered a spatial activity under that view.
So the concept of God you say is incoherent because he's non-spatial. Is that
Correct.
what I'm hearing?
Correct.
And why does something have to be in space to be coherent?
In space, well,
Hmm.
space is a substrate, right? So I wouldn't define space as a container of things. I'm a existence monist, which means I only believe there's one ontological category. So I would consider any activity that happens to be a spatial activity, not just an activity in space. So I am not reifying cognition, the cognition of measuring, for example, because you have to first determine that there's an ontological separation between measuring and other cognitive acts such as distinguishing or reasoning or inference. So
And
first we will have,
why do you think this? And when you say substrate, do you mean substance?
yeah, substance. I don't use the substance in the Latin form as substantia, which means a category or that which falls under. Um, the etymology of the word substance actually comes from ousia, right? So if you go far back to, I believe it was Aristotle, he defined space as a primary substance. He held to hylomorphism, which was basically a primary substance is, I believe, a form, matter and form. and he believed that secondary substances were dependent on a primary substance. So I basically do use substance in that way. However, I don't claim there are more than one substances. There's only one substance. All right. And so forms such as humans, myself and you.
Can I jump in here just
Oh
for
yeah,
the
sure, sure.
kind of so
Yeah,
one thing at a time here. So if space is the only substance that exists,
yeah.
well, a few things. First, you say God isn't coherent because he'd be spaceless. But why is that not begging the question that your definition of things that exist have to be spatial?
Well, it's not begging the question, firstly, because within my framework, the concept is coherent. Secondly, I don't
But
start
that
with
doesn't
the
make it
premise.
true, right?
Well, I wouldn't say that a definition can be truth apt. A definition something that could be coherent or incoherent, unless we are saying that a lexical definition must be stipulated in a certain way.
But why? I think
Mhm.
definitions can be true. That I mean,
In what sense?
well, a definition can be true or false.
How can a definition be true or false?
If I define human beings as orange monkeys on a tree, that would be false
Why would it be false?
because it's not what humans are.
Well, again, that's because of how you define the concept, right? So, if you define humans as monkeys on a tree, then it's a coherent concept because the label that you ascribe to monkeys on a tree is still coherent. So, it seems that you are making a prescriptivist claim that words should be defined in a specific way. Is that the argument you're making?
No, my argument is that definitions can be true or false. Someone can give a false definition of something. So, for example, here's a
Well,
perfect example.
hmm
You said earlier that
sure.
you're not an atheist, and
No,
then you gave a definition of what you were. That's not a true or false, right? So, because remember in the thumbnail, I put that you were an atheist, and you
no,
said later that you're
no.
not an atheist.
I'm not saying it's true or false. I'm saying a definition is either coherent or incoherent. So if
But
I
also
say
true or
I
false
am,
is what
so
I'm
if I
saying.
say right, I know that's what you're saying, but I am. Well, we differ on this, right? We could agree to disagree on this. The reason why I don't think it can be true or false because true or false is a cognitive evaluation. So with if a concept is coherent, right, then it isn't necessarily true or false, right? Unless what you're trying to say is by this sound or by this symbol, I am referring to this. So if the label that you're ascribing to actually fixes to a reference, right? Then it whether it's true or false is irrelevant because once it's coherent. So you could have a concept that is incoherent that cannot be true or false, right? We agree on that.
So
Or you
I
believe
think something.
concepts could only be coherent,
Well, concepts can be coherent or incoherent, but they can
right?
also be true or false. You can have a false conception of something
What would make it false?
that it doesn't correspond to reality.
Well, I mean, it depends. It don't have to correspond to reality. I mean, what you're doing is you're referring to a correspondence theory of truth, right?
Hmm.
But it have different theories of truth. It could be a coherentist theory of truth. So within my semantic framework, it could be true. So what you calling true could be false in my framework, and what I'm calling true could be false on your framework. So it really doesn't matter whether it's true or false. All that matters is if it's coherent or incoherent.
I
I
think it
mean,
largely matters if it's true or false.
in what sense?
Because I think we should believe true. I think it's normative for us to believe true things. We shouldn't believe things that are false.
Well, then you're presupposing normativity, then, right?
I mean, I think normativity is what we should aim for.
I know that's what you think, but can you prove that moral realism is true?
Well, but note how the very fact that you're asking if I can prove it is a normative inquiry. Because if
Well,
you if go
it's
ahead.
no, even if it's a normative inquiry, right? That is something that we that's a framework that we hold to, right? Um, so we will go into a framework of logic, right? That we share, right? And if we want to make a true evaluation within that agreed framework, right? Then we could say, well, if to justify X is to do so and so, right? Then then we should do that if we're working within that agreed upon framework because we already set the rules. Understand? But if we don't share the same agreements or constraints, right? Then there's no normativity behind anything. It's just what we prefer to do. So, I mean, a normative claim could just be reduced to something that we're determined to do.
But no, I don't think that would be make it normative. I think there are oughts and shoulds in reality.
Well,
For example, like if I
mhm.
don't agree to the law of gravity existing, I don't automatically get to fly.
Yeah, I agree that you don't automatically get to fly, right? Depending on what you mean by fly, right? But I don't see the ought there. What you're doing is you're conflating a is with a ought, right? You're describing what can happen and given what we know in reality, which is an epistemic possibility, and claiming that we ought not do something. But you're just collapsing the distinction between ought and is. That's all you're doing.
No, I don't think I am. In other words, so normativity deals with what we should do, what we ought to do, and I think
Well,
there is normativity.
mhm.
Are you denying normativity?
Yeah, fine. It's question begging. I'm a descriptivist. I don't believe in I'm anti-realist against any prescriptive claims. So are you saying that these claims are mind independent?
Um, are they mind independent?
Mm-hmm.
For them to exist, do we?
Are you saying oughts exist?
I think there are oughts. Yeah, I don't mind saying oughts exist.
So a ought is like a platonic object on your view?
So I'm not speaking in terms of Platonism. I mean there are things we ought to do and ought not to do.
Right, but that's question begging, right? That just presupposes what's under dispute. Why are there things that we ought to do?
Well, because I think there's teleology to the world. But what? So
You
so
mean
let's.
design? That's what
I
you mean?
think I think
Design.
teleology implies design. But I guess
But that's
let's
question
maybe.
begging again. I do agree that there's anything such as this. I believe design is just basically how we structure reality.
I know. Well, you asked me why I hold to that, and I'm telling you because I think there's
Okay.
teleology to the world. But let's
Hmm.
start with from the beginning.
Okay.
So, do you think we can have knowledge of truth?
Well, I wouldn't say we have knowledge. I believe that knowledge is our activity, and we are cognitive activities. We are not forms that have anything. So it seems like you're presupposing we are objects um, that do stuff. Correct?
Absolutely. So, and this is kind of why I wanted to go into the soul because I think this touches for the listeners. I know we did a few email exchanges about some certain
Mm-hmm.
things, and you sent me some definitions. And with the definitions you were proposing, I think if we talk about the soul, that would get right to the heart of everything we're discussing. So let me come out and say, as people who watch this channel know, I am a substance dualist. I
Okay.
believe I am a substance. I am a soul,
Okay.
and I ground my conscious states. I am a subject with experiences because
Mm-hmm.
thoughts have thinkers. If you
Mm-hmm.
reduce everything to space, however you define that,
Mm-hmm.
then it seems that would imply that space is doing the thinking.
Correct.
So you think space thinks?
Space acts. All acts. What space does. Correct. Is only one activity. So you hold to event ontology where events are separated things.
What do you mean by separated things?
Well, you believe that events are existence. Is that what you hold to?
I think events happen. If you want to say their existence, sure.
So
But
so
but
so,
you
so
said space thinks. I think that's a. It. I would say without
no.
any
Well, I
respect.
mean, if space is the only substance and only a substance could act, then it follows that only space can think. Correct.
So
If
you are
thinking
space.
is an act. If I'm space,
Are you space?
no, I'm not a substance. I'm a cognitive activity of space.
Who's doing the thinking?
Who is acting? Space is acting. We are all necessarily human cognitive activities.
So when you have a thought, what is
I
having that
don't
thought?
have a thought. I don't have a thought. I am the thinking. I am the cognitive activity itself. I am the total cognitive activity of this spatial region, this form that I am in. I'm the total cognitive activity of the spatial region of this
So
form.
you don't have thoughts.
Um, well, I just explained to you that I am the thinking itself. I am the cognitive activity itself. So you see what you're doing. You're presupposing that I am a substance, and I already clarified that I'm not a substance.
I'm just trying to get clear on your view. You said space
Yeah,
thinks, and then I asked
correct. Yeah.
you who's having when you have a thought, who's having that thought, and you said you're not having the thought. Is that right?
No. Well, colloquially, we would say, I do this, you do that, right? But we are not really doing anything, because what you're doing is you're presupposing libertarian free will, right? Because
I'm just trying to get clear on your view again.
I know, and I'm clarifying. I'm
Okay.
clarifying that we are not substances, right? We are the cognitive activities of forms of substance. So the human body would be a spatial form, and we are the cognitive activity of that form. You understand? So how neurologists would say, for example, when the brain stops functioning, you would cease to be. The spatial form is still there.
I don't
You are
think
no longer the spatial
neuroscientists
form.
say that.
Of course, it is a difference between biological death and different death. The death where your heart stops, and the death where your brain ceases to function.
In other words, you would cease to be alive. But I wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
say you cease to be,
Well,
but
uh, well,
biologically,
I
then.
I am a living activity. That I'm a cognitive activity. I'm a. So what you're trying to say? I'm not alive. Is that what you're trying to say?
No, you said neuroscientists say that when your brain ceases, you cease to be, and I would just say I wouldn't say that they say that. Yes, your biological life ceases, but I don't think you cease to be. But I don't want to spend a lot of time on that point.
Well, I
I
mean,
still want to get
that would presuppose the soul, right? Which is exactly what we're debating right now.
so.
Hmm.
Let me ask it again. So, or let me ask it this way: when there's a thought that I would say you have,
Right.
what is a thing that is thinking?
What is the thing not thinking?
Hmm.
The substrate, this spatial substrate. Everything that can be ostensibly referred to.
But so space, when you have a thought, it's not you thinking; it's space thinking.
Correct. Space is the only substance there is. There's no disconnection between any spatial object. So that's why I was saying that you want to have a discussion on whether or not the soul is an existent, and we need to first clarify what qualifies as an existent. If there's only one substrate, which is space, then only one substrate can be acting. Correct? Does that follows, right?
It,
So we need to determine whether or not there's more than one substance in order for your argument to stand, right?
I don't. Is it consistent? I suppose. I just don't think it makes sense.
Well, that
So
would be
like,
a appeal
here's
to common sense,
here's
right?
a comment, Brando, and I think Brando's on fire tonight. He says, "How does space have thoughts? Idealism presupposes everything is conscious, but how does space have consciousness?" What are your
Well,
thoughts
I'm
there?
not an idealist, first and foremost, right? I'm a spatial monist. Space doesn't have thoughts because you're not containing it. You're using spatial language to say you have thoughts, right? As in you are the owner, or the thing that is thinking, right? Because a thought is really just the nominalization of thinking, right? We do this a lot in language. We turn verbs into nouns, right? So reasoning is reason, relating is relation, distinguishing is distinction, right? We do that in language. In the philosophy of language, you learn how these things happen, right? So um so the universe doesn't have thoughts. The universe is changing, right? And within that process of change, right, there are regions that perform or carry out activities we consider thinking. You understand? So thinking is an
I don't.
activity of something that exists, right? Because
So
we both agree that only something that exists can perform the function thinking, correct?
I think only a subject can perform.
Only, but a subject could be a recursive self pattern of cognitive activity. For example, right? AI. The AI would refer to themselves, right,
But I don't think AI
as
is conscious.
I, but of course you don't think it's conscious, right? But it's still self-referring. You understand?
I
There's
don't think
still a
there is a self
self-reference. Well,
for AI.
we could disagree on what you qualify as the self, right? But for now, in terms of their semantic framework, they still use the indexical term I. Yeah, even though you don't believe that they are a self, correct?
Here, what do you think? Because I know we started on truth. I'm curious here. Ask him if we can know anything for truth or facts. He would deny that we can come to truth.
Well, it depends on what we mean by truth, right? You have different theories of truth. You could have a coherentist theory of truth. You could have a pragmatic theory of truth. You could have a correspondence theory of truth, right? So basically, truth
And
is
explain that for the audience,
conditional, right?
would you? Those
Yeah,
two theories.
truth is basically like a property of propositions, right? A proposition could be true or false, right? So for a proposition to even be evaluated as true or false, it needs to have concepts within the statement that makes it meaningful. Understand? So if you have a statement that's not meaningful, then it cannot be true or false,
I don't
right?
think so. When you
So you think a meaningless statement can be true or false?
oh, no,
Is that what you're
well,
arguing?
I probably jumped in too early because I'm reflecting on some of the
Okay,
definitions you gave.
I mean,
Because
again, ahead of you.
uh, no,
Hmm.
I'm getting ahead of myself. That was my fault. So because I think you because even earlier you said that the concept of God, you said if it's
Hmm.
meaningless. I don't think based on what you're saying,
Hmm.
just trying to stick to one thing because you're throwing out a lot, which is fine because you
Sorry.
have quite a no, it's not.
Yeah.
I don't mind at all. There's a
Okay.
lot to unpack because you have quite a unique view.
Oh, yeah, I do
I don't
actually. Very
think makes
esoteric.
sense, but I yes, there you go, very esoteric.
Well, it's probably not intuitive, but I mean, I have arguments to conclude what I've come to. If you want, we could go through the arguments.
Well, so let's go back to just truth.
Okay.
I would say
Yeah.
truth is that which corresponds to reality. How do you define truth?
Truth is a cognitive evaluation of a meaningful statement.
But that doesn't tell me what truth is. That tell me what I do with truth.
No, it tells you what truth is. Truth is a spatial activity. A cognitive evaluation is a spatial activity. That is an identity claim. As
So
identity relation, it tells you
is
what
it
it is.
is
It's
it
a
co?
different. Hmm. Go ahead.
I know one of your standards is coherence.
Yeah.
How is it not coherent to say that God can be a disembodied mind, non-spatially extended, and have thoughts? How is that incoherent?
Because a mind is not a substance. A mind is the total cognitive activity of a brain. We just nominalize the totality. We just group all the cognitive activities that we could discern, and we just label it mind. That's what we do is nomination. So whenever you say a mind exists, what you are doing is engaging in a fallacy called hypostatization. It's called hypostatization via nominalism. It's basically when you turn a verb into a noun and then you label this noun an existent. So we have to now determine what an existent is. Is it if it has a meaningful reference to the term existent, or is it just semantic bootstrapping? So we need to figure out whether or not we just reifying cognitive activity. So that's what would say a mind is. So if you say, for example, that God is a mind, then what in my framework, God will have to be a spatial activity. But
Why
then
should we accept your framework?
why should you accept my framework? Why should we accept any framework? So so my framework, right, starts with what is self-defeating to deny. So I come to, if we have the same constraints, which is why I was saying that debate is not is debate is pointless if it is we don't have constraints on how do we adjudicate between what we determine as true or false. So if it is, for example, that I just stipulate something as true, for example, I just stipulate that a soul is not existent, right? Well, first you need to understand what I mean by a soul and what I mean by existence. But if I stipulate it and I just say this is true, you could make the same move. It's symmetrical, right? So we need to have some kind of constraints to say, for example, that we can't come to truth by just stipulating what is true.
Right?
Understand?
Sure, I agree.
Because right, so we have to have some kind
And
of
remind me
principle
how you
reason.
define truth.
Truth is a cognitive evaluation, right?
Yeah, I still don't know
Based
what that
on
means.
coherence. You don't know what a cognitive evaluation is. You don't
I
know what
don't
it
I don't
means to evaluate something.
I don't know what it means to say that truth is an evaluative cognition. I don't even remember how you worded it, but it's interesting that you said we have to have. That's a normative statement. That's an
We have to
ought.
have what?
You said we have to have. You started a statement with we have to have. That's a normative statement. That's an ought. That's a should.
You can repeat the statement.
You had
I'm trying to understand the context.
you said we have to. You began one of your last statements with we have to have when you were talking about
Well, that's a descriptive claim. I'm not saying like we should do this or we should do that, right? I'm saying that for us to engage in meaningful conversation, right? That there must be some coherence in the language itself, right?
So we ought to have coherence.
I'm not saying we ought to have coherence. I'm describing a consequence of not acting coherently.
And if we want to act,
Conversation and meaningful will basically deteriorate. So if you prefer to engage in meaningful conversation, right, you will act according to what is coherent, right? If you
but
want to,
you see how hard you're struggling to not say ought and should.
I'm not struggling to say that. I'm explaining that I'm making a descriptive claim. I'm not a prescriptivist. So I don't make the claim that we ought to do X or we ought to do Y, right? I'm just explaining the consequences of not doing X or not doing Y. Understand? If I was to just go, blah, 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 for example, right, and I say, "Oh, that is meaningful," it wouldn't come across as meaningful to you, right? So there must be some kind of constraints for us to engage in a rational or coherent conversation, right? So I could make a noise and I could put a reference to it in a way that you could understand, so that we could engage in meaningful dialogue. You understand? So it really comes down to how do we fix meaning itself.
Let's because I kind of don't know where like there's so many areas to hit and touch on. Um, because like you're saying, this is very esoteric. So what if we just someone asks, why do you accept your framework, Corey?
Why do I accept my framework, or
Mhm.
why should you accept my framework? I'm not too sure.
Let's start with why do you accept it?
Why do I accept my framework?
Hmm.
So for one, is coherent. Also, is a proclivity. Is also what I'm determined to do. So I'm a strict determinist and a necessitarian. So I believe that everything that unfolds is the necessary result of the initial conditions of a substrate. So I believe anything that we do is necessarily determined. So I don't make any argument that you should accept my framework or someone should accept any framework. Basically, the argument I'm making is that a coherent concept for me to understand what you mean by it, right? First needs it should it shouldn't should, but it if it's not fixed, then I wouldn't understand what you mean by it.
Quincy Prickett says he was actually just at my house. Space is having meaningful dialogue with space. Is that
No,
an accurate representation of your view?
no. What is happening is there's cognitive activities at different regions of space, right? That is happening.
But there's only one
So
substance, and that's space, right?
yes, there's only one substance. So
Because you said
so so space is obviously whatever activity is happening is space is doing it, but space is not treating itself as a separate entity, for example.
but because you said part of the reason you hold to this is because it's coherent. I don't think it is. And I know we
Well
disagree,
then
but
tell me why it's not coherent.
well, because you said you don't have thoughts. You said space has thoughts. I don't know how space can have
And
thoughts.
because space is a substance. So if it's a substance, can a substance have thoughts? Well, not have thoughts, but remember I clarified that it carries out activities that we consider thoughts.
Okay,
It's
so
thinking, right?
what
So
I
what I
think
just want to know what makes it incoherent is what I'm
well,
asking.
I'm giving you
Is it
one.
that
I don't think space can
you don't
have
think
thoughts. I think
space could be a substrate? Is that what you're saying?
well, I don't think it is a substance, but I don't think
So
space. I
what
think you
qualifies
have
as a
thoughts.
substance? So
Uh,
is
it's
uh-huh.
it's an endurance through change. It classifies its
So space doesn't endure through change.
well, we can talk about because the
No,
space
seriously, think
endured
about
through
it. Yeah, think
right,
about
but
it.
well, what is space on your view? Because like
Everything that could be ostensibly referred to. There's no
I
ontological
can
separation
ostensibly
between forms.
I can ostensibly refer to my thoughts, but I don't think my thoughts have space or are located
No,
in space, nor are they
your
spatial.
thoughts. How do you ostensibly refer to yourself? Because you are the
By
cognitive
giving
activity.
examples of my mental states. I can give you examples of pain. I can give you examples of pleasure. That's
Yeah, but
ostensibly reference. And for the audience, define what ostensive is, because I know that's part of your definition. Space is that which can be ostensibly referred to. Is that right? Is that what you said?
yeah, so space is basically not just what could be ostensibly referred to, but it's also what grounds activity and structure. So what you're doing is you are referring to thoughts, which are activities, right?
Hmm?
So space is what grounds the activity. It is what is acting. So
How
if
are
you are
space? How are thoughts in space?
thoughts are not in space. Thoughts are what space does. It's an active. It's from a location. If you could identify
Space is
anything,
conscious.
space exhibits conscious behavior. Yes.
So when you have a thought and I have a thought, it's all the same space having thought.
Yes, space is the only thing that's acting.
See that I don't know how that can be coherent. Space,
Explain. Uh huh.
because selves have thoughts, conscious subjects have thoughts,
Because
persons have
well,
thoughts.
I mean that's just question begging, right?
I don't think so.
I
I
think
don't.
so.
You don't think
I think
persons have?
so.
Do thoughts have thinkers?
I already said that a thinker or the one that is acting is the substance, and the substance is space. So I'm not
So
denying that thoughts have thinkers. I'm saying space is the thinker. You understand?
I get what you're
Is that
saying. I get that
coherent?
you're saying that. I don't think it
Is
is.
that
I don't know.
coherent?
I don't know how space can have thoughts.
You don't know how space could change.
It
So
can change, but thoughts
okay.
are.
So okay, would you say a thought is an activity?
It's a mental activity.
Right. So this is my argument, right? We start with activity, which is an epistemic primitive, right? We have to start with distinguishing. Before we could even evaluate a proposition, make a statement, discern or distinguish between this and that, we have there must be distinguishing as a epistemic primitive, right? So we could start with that. That's premise one, right? Distinguishing is an epistemic activity. We could agree on that on premise one.
That
I just want to
distinguishing
make
is
an argument, yeah. Premise
it's a
one.
mental activity. You can make
Wait,
you can distinguish things mentally if that's what you're saying.
wait. But
Yes.
as so when you say it's a mental activity, are you presupposing mind? The mind is a substance. Is that what you're doing? I just starting with activity. You seem to be inferring that
Well,
whatever is acting is a mind. Is that what you're
well,
doing?
what else besides minds make distinguish things?
Well, minds is just the normalization of all cognitive activities. So just because you group all cognitive activity doesn't make it something that's acting. That's like
I don't
for
think I'm
example,
making any presuppositions. I'm just saying minds are what make
that
are
is a
what make distinctions.
presupposition
You
because
don't think mind?
I'm a strict nominalist. So the claim, so I would be anti-reification and anti-Platonism. So Platonism would basically be like abstract things are existence. So, for example, universal thoughts, knowledge, truth, or even mind. Mind is basically just you're labeling all the cognitive activity that is happening and you're calling it mind. That's basically that's
Do you believe
reification.
minds
That's a
exist?
fallacy. No, a mind does not exist. A mind is just activity.
Minds don't exist.
No, minds don't exist. No.
So you don't
You
have a
familiar with
mind.
nominalism?
Uh huh.
Are you familiar with nominalism?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Nominalism won't
nominalism,
deny minds.
nominalism. There are aspects of nominalism that do deny minds are existence.
I think that's wild because I don't see how.
I mean, you could look into it if you want, but nominalism doesn't say that a mind exists. They don't. Nominalism is against reifying activity, basically. So they would say all abstract things are basically cognitive activities. So you should look into strict nominalism
I,
because on it doesn't entail that a mind exists.
I'm just still blown away that you don't think minds exist.
No, I don't
Um,
think it is. So we'll depend. Well, we need to define what an existent is, right?
anything
Because
I would
right now we.
say
Go ahead.
existence is anything that possesses a property. It exists. If something possesses a property, it exists.
If something possesses a property exists,
It
and how is that
exists.
not just a description?
I mean, I think it's primitive. Existence is a primitive. It's you
Primitive
can't.
as in what? You can't define it. Is what you're trying to say?
Now that you can't define it, that at some point you get to a base where there's no further. You don't go to something simpler. So
No, I mean
existence.
I agree there is something fundamental, but we need to determine what that fundamental thing is.
And if I'm not mistaken, you think something that exists has to be spatially located, right?
It have to be able to ground structure and change, and it have to be ostensive.
Okay, so my
So
soul fits all that, but my soul's not located in space.
your soul is what we under dispute right now, right? So, what do you mean by a soul?
An immaterial substance that grounds or possesses consciousness and animates the body.
Okay, well then we need to clarify what you mean by material and what you mean by substance, right? And
Sure.
consciousness. We need to figure out that is because I don't see consciousness as an existent either. Consciousness is cognitive activity. It's just the normalization of cognitive activity.
You don't think consciousness exists?
No, I don't. Consciousness doesn't exist. Consciousness is just the normalization
Do you
of
believe
cognitive
that?
activity.
You believe that?
If I believe that
Yeah.
is a propositional attitude.
Right, which is a mental state, which requires a
A,
mind,
a,
which is a
no,
conscious state.
no, it does
So
not require mind. That's question back and again. You're presupposing a mind exists.
no, so this is wild to me. So
Okay,
how would you define?
if our mind exists, wouldn't that be granting either idealism or substance dualism?
No, because there are
Explain.
reductive physicalists that just reduce
Mm-hmm.
the mind to brain, but they don't assume either one of those.
Or you mean like the mind is so you mean the mind is the form itself, the spatial form? That's what you mean?
No,
Or
you're
the
saying
activity of the form?
you're
Which
saying
one?
if I assume minds exist, then I'm either
Mm-hmm.
an idealist or a dualist, and I'm saying no. There are people who are physicalists who identify the mind as just the brain, so they don't agree to dualism or idealism, and
But
yet they
that don't
believe
make
minds
sense,
exist.
right? Let me explain why that don't make sense, right? Because if the brain is a spatial substrate or a form, right? Then we're not talking about the activity of the form, are we? So so you would say if you label the brain a mind, right? Then you're just collapsing the distinction between brain and mind, right? Is that what you say a physicalist is probably doing? That they would just say that the brain is a mind?
That the mind is a brain. That's what a strict physicalist would say. Yes.
Not all strict physicalists would say that. Some strict physicists would actually say that the mind is brain activity.
Then they wouldn't be strict physicalists. They would be like property dualist, a non what's called
No,
non-reductive
not
physicalist.
if they are
Hmm.
nominalists. They don't have to believe that property is something existent.
Here's my point: you don't have to be a dualist or an idealist to say the mind exists. And so I would define consciousness as five mental states. You have thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and volition. To deny consciousness exists is to deny
Hmm.
beliefs exist. But then you're going to have
No,
to make the
well,
self-defeating
yeah,
statement
beliefs do.
that
Yeah,
I
beliefs.
believe beliefs do not exist, which is self-defeating.
No, it's not self-defeating to
It's not
say that
self-defeating to say that you believe that beliefs don't exist.
I believe that beliefs don't exist.
Yeah.
It's not. No, it's not self-defeating because beliefs are not things that exist. How is it self-defeating?
To say that you believe that beliefs
Hmm.
don't exist,
Hmm.
that is self-defeating.
Well, the belief is a propositional attitude that space is doing, right?
I don't think space is doing. I don't even know what that means to say space has beliefs. But
Okay, okay. Are you a body? Are you a spatial body? Yes or no?
I have a body. I am not a body.
Is a body a substance or not?
No.
So you're not. So you're not a substance dualist then.
Great question. So I would hold to a type of Thomistic like dualism, where I don't think the body's a
Explain.
substance. So the body's not a substance. It's something physical. So substance dualism.
So the physical is not a substance.
There could be physical substances, but I don't think my body is a substance. My
So
body
then,
is
what
not
qualifies as a physical substance on your view?
something that is not composed of parts.
Parts. When you say parts, like separated things that are separated.
Right, something that is something that's not composed of separable parts. So
So, but then again, you presuppose an ontological pluralism. So you need to justify that existence as separated.
no, no.
Because you're saying
There
if
could
it made
be
of parts, right? If it made of parts, because not all,
composed of physical parts.
right, but
So
not all physicalists, right, would hold to atomism, right? They wouldn't say that there might be a priority monist, right? Or so not all physicalists believe in parts or things are reducible to parts. You agree with that, right? So a physicalist could, for example, say the body, but you say that you don't believe the body is a substance. You
right,
believe
it's
because
an
the
aggregate, I
body,
would say.
right? Because you believe the body is made up of parts, right?
Hmm.
Right.
Right, it's not a true whole. So
So
that
let
part
me
of a
ask you.
substance is a true whole in and of itself.
So let me ask you a question: is the body made up of parts,
Hmm.
and is each part a substance, a physical substance?
No, so this is a really good question,
Hmm.
actually, that gets
Oh, you're
technical.
confusing me now.
So, so I forget the terminology, but if there are physical substances, you would it's something on the atomic theory of matter, where you have like base particles that might be substances. But if something, in other words, like my car is not a substance. It's because a substance, I would define a substance as a true whole in and of itself. A car is not
But
a
then,
substance because it's composed of separable parts. So uh, um, you can have, if you were to take all the pieces of a car apart, if I take a tire off a car, the tire maintains its existence and identity as a tire because its existence and identity is not dependent on its connection to the other parts.
hmm.
So if you have something that is composed of parts whose existence and identity depends on those parts and structure, then it's not a true substance. It's not a whole in and of itself.
But
Think
then
of
you're presupposing mereological pluralism. What about a
it's
mereological
neurological
dualist?
essentialism. I am
All right, but
neurological
that's my point.
essentialism. Yes.
But I mean, that's basically something I would argue against. I would say that you cannot justify that there's ontological separation. You can't say that there are ontological parts that are separated and form your body.
Let me ask what I think let's get to heart of it because like
I
there
mean, we could go into the arguments for them. Right now we're just having an informal discussion. But if you want the argument for that, I could give you that as well.
sure go for it because I
Okay.
someone earlier asked any way would there be any way to prove an immaterial entity could exist for Corey?
No, because well,
So you've
it depends
defined
on what you
it.
mean by material, right? If, for example, you're using material interchangeably in the way that I use space, then no, there cannot be an immaterial entity
So you just
because
define it semantically into that that's not even possible for God or the soul to exist because they're immaterial.
um well, according to that's how I define space, right? Based on the necessary conditions for referencing or any cognitive activity.
Is logic spatially located?
No, that's a category error. You are conflating a spatial activity with a spatial object.
Is activity
Activity,
located?
the activity already passed is a state transition. So you cannot locate something that already happened. You can't locate an
When
event. You understand that?
I sure you can. So if I raise my hand, I can give you the GPS coordinates for me raising my hand.
No,
That's
you
that's
can't.
an activity
You
that
no, you couldn't give me a position. You can't give me the act because it's a temporal thing. You understand? It is not a position. What you're doing is you're conflating a zero-dimensional point, which is a location, right? Or the area, the region where the activity happens, but is the
which is
activity
spatially
is
located.
not a state, it's not static, right? So that means it's a state transition. So you it happens somewhere, right? Because it's happening to space, right?
So it does have a location.
What events have a location? No, a
Some events
event
do.
doesn't have a location. That's what I'm trying to say. Events are state transitions. You understand?
Where
A
these state transitions happen.
No, a state transition is what the substance does, right? The substance, when it's static, right? It will be a state because a state would just be an arrangement of the substance, right? It would be like a non-homogeneous structure. So a state transition is just from one structure to another. You don't locate the previous structure, you understand what I'm saying? Because it's two different structures. You can't locate two different structures simultaneously. You understand?
I Not really.
Okay, okay,
If
okay, okay.
if you
Let me try and
if
put
you
this
change
another way.
shirts, that is an event, right? I
Right.
live in America. You live in Caribbeans.
Mhm.
Your event of changing a shirt, can I say that's located in the Caribbeans?
No, you can't locate the event of me changing a shirt. How you
So you don't.
locating the event? It already happened.
You're
You
talking
mean
right
you,
now.
so okay, I think what you're trying to do is like you're trying to say, all right, this is the area where that event happened. But that means it don't pass, right? So you're trying to say the past event, what happened before, happened somewhere because it was a spatial change, right? But
I
sorry, you want to say
I
something?
well okay. Let me change because I think you're getting stuck on the fact that because it's like you're looking for a moment, and if the moment passes, all of a sudden you can't locate it. I mean, I first of all I don't agree, but maybe let me
So
change.
you can't locate a moment that passed.
So let's talk about a baseball game. A baseball game consists of 9 innings, right? So
Hmm.
we have lots of time to locate where a baseball game is happening. Can we
Right.
locate a baseball game?
You could say the area where the event is happening, right?
So it has location, yes?
No, the event doesn't have location. The event is what space is doing. You understand?
No,
It is what the substrate is doing.
I don't understand because because to me this is wild that because you said you don't have thoughts, consciousness and mind doesn't exist. You can't locate a baseball game. Like this seems like wild
Yeah, it will.
ontologically.
I mean, it is unique. Um, Obviously, you're appealing to common sense because a lot of people intuitively refer to themselves as that which is acting, right?
You don't think you
And
act?
sorry,
You don't think you act?
I am an activity. I am the activity itself. I am not that which is acting. That which is acting is space, the substrate. You understand what I'm saying? So this body, right, that you would say I am, right? This is made of a substance, right? You would say
Okay.
it's not a substance because there are indivisible parts that make up the body, right? I'm saying there's no separation between any two parts, right? Because
So
then
are
you
you
have
and
to
I
account.
distinct?
Yeah, we are qualitatively distinct,
Yeah, but there's only one substance.
right? We're not ontologically identical. That's the difference.
But when you have a thought and I have a thought, both
We
those
don't
thoughts,
have thoughts. You keep repeating the same thing I already clarified for you. I know it's
and
hard for you to say. Okay, so colloquially, we would say we have thoughts, right? So basically, your cognitive activity and my cognitive activity is spatially differentiated, right? Because your thinking happens somewhere else, and my thinking happens where I am in Trinidad,
well, when
right?
you say my thinking,
So we are spatially. My is just a colloquialism. It's just a way to self-refer to the activity that is happening. You understand?
you uh, it seems to me that it's telling that if your view has to use language that is intuitive, like I am thinking, and you have to reject that language, technically speaking,
I don't have to reject that language. I could just say that language is a colloquialism. It is not it doesn't commit me to any ontological commitments. And that's what you're trying to push on me. You're trying to say that because I'm saying I act, for example, that that presupposes that I am the substance that acts. I'm saying no. I refers to the self-referential pattern of cognitive activity that a
self
substrate is undergoing.
self-referential, not what you just said. Are you a self?
No, self-referential just means the activity I identify as the cognitive activity. Understand? So what let me explain what it is that this Descartes, and you know Descartes who came up with the cogito ergo sum,
Yeah. And
he
someone said, I think, therefore
presupposed,
I'm not.
yeah, so I'm saying that, right? So what Descartes did is he presupposed that he was that which was thinking. He did not self associate himself with the thinking itself. So, yes, we know something is thinking, right? But we are the thinking itself. We are the cognitive activity. We are the awareness. We are the distinguishing because
Then you
we are
don't
not static
maintain.
objects. We are dynamic things, right?
Yeah,
We are activities. We are not bodies. We are not spatial forms because for example, when thinking stops or whatever the case is, right? The body is still there. It will just change into a different form. But that the substance that's underlying the body, right, is still there. It doesn't disappear, it doesn't go into non-existence, whatever that means. Right? It just redistributes. Understand? The density just it differs. Right? So the problem with the cogito, right, is the I is presupposing something other than the thinking. So what Descartes did is he reified the thinking or the cognitive activity and called it the substance that was thinking. Understand? But he was not able, right, to justify ontological separation between anything else. You understand? Because either he would hold to solipsism, right, which is basically that all he could prove is that something is acting, which he calls I, right, which he refers to as the I, right? But the activity itself, which is referencing, that is distinguishing, that is being aware of something, is an activity. It is not that which is acting. So
So
whenever we say
let me
I
interject here
am
though.
not, I
I
am not the activity, right? What you
I am not my thoughts. I have thoughts.
no, you are your thoughts. You are your cognitive
So I
activity.
change. I become a different person every time I change thoughts.
No, so does an event change just because it's an event?
Hmm. Yeah. If I am my thoughts and I'm thinking about
Wait, how
Taco
does it?
Bell, then when
Hmm.
I change thoughts, then I'm no longer the activity of thinking about Taco Bell. Then if I am reducible to my thoughts, and every time I change thoughts, I become a
Yeah,
different
but
person.
thoughts are not separated. There is one activity, ongoing activity. You are a consistent pattern of cognitive activity.
Are thoughts not reflective of statements, propositions, things like that?
Not necessarily, you know.
But
There's
are some
phenomenal
thoughts
awareness. You don't need to think.
are some thoughts reflections on propositions or statements? Yes or no?
Well, you have to think for there to even be a proposition, right? So is it
My
just
point
it's
is
just distinguishing, right?
I
That's
can
all.
change my thoughts about statements, but if I am my thoughts,
Hmm.
then once I change to a different thought, then how can I still be the same person?
Because you are not one thought, you are not one activity.
Well, then
You
you
are
can't
an
say that I am
ongoing
my
cognitive
thoughts.
activity.
So well
Yeah, but
then
yeah, because what you're doing is you're separating your cognitive activity into parts. You're cutting it up into different
well
like
yes, I have
parts.
different
That's what you're
states.
doing, right?
Well, I am.
No. So what I would say a state is a spatial arrangement, and an activity is a state transition. So
But
you can be a state transition, right? Even if it entails a change in transition in states. You understand what I'm trying to get at?
what is it? What underlies the change? When I change thoughts, what is the thing that is grounding those thoughts?
The substance grounds activity.
Which you say is space.
Yeah.
And how does space have thoughts? Or how does space ground thoughts? To use your language,
How does space change? Is that
how
what you're
does
asking me?
space ground thoughts?
Well, to ground activity, this means to change. So
There has
space. So for
There
space.
has to be
So
something that grounds a change. Change is not grounding. Change must be grounded by something else. When I
why
go
must wait?
from
Why must change be grounded by something other than the substance that is changing?
no, I agree that a substance is going to ground change.
We're right. Well,
But
that's what I'm saying. Space is the substance that grounds change.
you said it was the changing that's grounds, unless I
What?
misunderstood you.
Sorry. The changing that grounds what?
That maybe I misunderstood you. But
Maybe yeah.
going back to because I'm still just blown away. So if there's
You
no
see, because
mind or
my memory is informal, and we discussing a lot of very
no,
esoteric
yeah,
ideas.
yes, but I just think they're wild.
I
So
know they are wild because they're
if
not
there's no
popular.
mind, then what's I don't
Wait,
know how to ask
wait.
that.
The mind is the totality of cognitive activity. So the activity is real because it is what space, the substance, is doing. So I'm not saying the mind isn't real. I am just saying what the mind is. The mind is the nominalization of cognitive activity. So you're making it sound like I'm saying there is no mind. No,
I
I'm
thought you did say that
identifying
earlier.
what the
You
mind.
denied
No,
a
I did.
mind.
No, you asked if the mind was an existent. And I said, no, only the substance exists. So when
So
you ask me, does
minds
a
don't
mind
exist.
exist? No, minds don't exist because minds are activities. An activity is not an existent. An existent is the substance that acts, that grounds the activity.
I
Is
don't even know
that
what that
clear?
means. I
How
don't
you,
think
how
so.
you don't know what it means? Okay, let me say
How
it.
can
Let me try and say it
something?
in the next way.
Okay,
Let me try and say it in the next way. Okay. Okay. So there's a substance, right? We agree that a
which you
substance
say
can
is
act.
space.
It don't matter what I label it at this point, right?
Okay,
Label it rainbows, right? So the substance is rainbows, right? And a substance can change, it can act, right? So so basically, if the substance grounds activity, then all that means is the substance is that which is acting, which just means that the substance is changing. And when I mean by changing, right, I mean is changing between states, like a state of homogeneity, where it's like everywhere is just evenly distributed, for example, uh, to non-homogeneous structures, right? But is ongoing, so it's like a flux. You familiar with Heraclitus from the
Mm-hmm.
Greeks?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So Heraclitus, he believed that reality was always in flux, right?
Mm-hmm.
Also, for him, change wasn't distinct temporal paths lined up in an orderly fashion, right? Because then a static, you would just have static distribution of temporal points, right? So Heraclitus believes that change is ongoing and is continuous and is not separated, it's smooth, right? So what you must have is a substance. So to ground activity, there must be something that was initially not active. So the initial conditions for activity is something that is not itself acting, right? So that means any initial condition for existence must be static and prior to acting. So one of the initial conditions for existence is it must be static, because because
I
because because you cannot have an infinite regress of activity. We agree on that, right?
Yeah, I don't
So
think
that
infinite
means
regresses can exist. I agree
I,
that.
well, I don't say infinite. Our infinity is a process, right? So an infinite regress, right, of activity, right, is impossible, and is not logically impossible. It's metaphysically impossible, and it's metaphysically impossible because we are experiences, we are activities, and there cannot be an infinite regress of state transitions and there still being a present state transition. So that's how we know, for example, there cannot be an infinite regress of activity, right? So we know that initially there must be a state of existence, whatever that is, we haven't determined that yet. There must be a state of existence initially that was static before it started changing, before any activity happened.
So for there to be change, there has to be something that has always been unchanging,
Always, that's a temporal word. What do you mean by always?
eternally, however you
No,
want to put it.
eternal doesn't mean always. Eternal just means a substance that cannot come into or go out of existence.
I
That's
think
all
you're
it means.
arguing a lot of semantics, but okay, how would you put it?
Right. So
Rephrase
a
it.
substance is eternal if it cannot be emergent.
No, I meant you seem to be implying that there must be something that
Mhm.
was unchanging. How would you phrase that using your semantic terminology?
Well, that's just a logical necessity given that we experience, right? When I say a logical necessity, I mean that if activity begins, right, then that which acts must initially be non-active prior to acting.
Okay, so
Would you
if there
agree with
must
that?
be, how finish the statement for me. There must be what for there to be activity? I said always. You don't like that
Right.
word. How
So
would you phrase it?
the conditions for activity entails an existence that was initially not active and then began acting. You understand?
What was
Activity
this
began.
thing?
So that means the initial state of existence couldn't have been itself acting because activity is a state transition, right? That means they must have a full state. That state cannot itself be a state transition.
Because so far you're
So
sounding like you're making an argument for God. It's like therefore God exists. If there must
how?
be something
Wait,
that
how?
that
How am
has
I
been
making an
static,
argument for God?
because if you're saying that there must prior to any change, there must be something that was continuing that didn't change, that started the change.
Well,
But it's like, well, therefore God exists.
well, you just defining those conditions as God as a
It
functional
sounds like what
definition.
you were saying.
Well, that's my point. My point is that we just highlighting the initial conditions of existence. We're not labeling it as yet.
Well, I'm
Because
saying you don't have
okay,
to.
so if you label that God, I could just label that space and voila, God is spatial.
Sure, and then we can get
Which
into the
and then
arguments for which
and
one
then
would
it
make more
contradicts the
sense.
whole Bible that defines God as non-spatial.
Doesn't contradict, but
Think about it.
so
If
let's go
your
to.
concept, all right, go ahead. You want to change topic? Go ahead.
Well, because I feel like I feel like we keep
I know,
going.
it's a lot, a lot. I think you
Um,
see what when we going a little fast. I think if we slow down the pace, or we actually have like a formal debate where we have
let's talk about how about can we
premises,
talk about
something.
free will? Because I think that's something that
Well,
that we could.
can you will your will? Mm.
Can I will my will? Yes.
So you have an infinite regression of willing then.
No.
So how do you will the will that wills?
How do I will the will that wills? Why do I have to do that?
So is willing is a will a activity or a platonic object?
It's an activity. I don't even know if I understand the question. I
Is okay. What is a will?
What is a will?
Mm-hmm.
It's a volitional state. I think I don't know. It can be various things. I think, but because you told me you're a strict determinist, right? You don't believe there
Yes,
is
I'm a
okay.
strict determinist. Yeah.
How now that's another wild thing to me because then if you're a strict determinist, then why should
Then everything we're doing right now is determined. So I
well not
don't
just
make
that,
any
including your
prescriptive claims.
thoughts and beliefs are all determined, and I don't see how you could have any rational justification for what you believe
Well,
because
it
if it's all
doesn't
just
follow that. It doesn't follow that rationality must be undetermined to occur. That doesn't
so
follow. As a non
so if
sequitur.
one I didn't say that, but
Oh, sorry, I misunderstood.
I asked a question. How do
What's the
you
question?
know? How will you know that any of your? How would you have any rational justification for what you believe if things are just happening and you're like a passive cog, if you will? If you're just, if I can put it, just kind of bluntly, so to speak, if you're just another domino in a line of dominoes falling, and this
Mm,
domino hits this one and causes you to believe that space is all there is and space has thoughts and everything else that I think is wild that you said.
yeah.
How can you rationally justify that?
Well, because of the nature of justification itself. It depends on how justification functions, right? So, what if the activity that we are exhibiting qualifies as justification or justifying, which is just another cognitive act, right? Then you don't need to be free in some vague sense just for the activity to occur. So if rationality or justification is just an activity, it doesn't need to be free from a prior condition to occur.
Well,
So
that
if
I haven't
also,
argued that though. My question is, how would you?
well, you
Because
asked me a question, I was just answering your question.
it seems, in other words, it seems that to be rational, so far you would have to. Would you not have to say that I believe what I do because I was determined to, and
Yeah,
then once you start,
we
and
will
then once
all
you
our,
start to
mm,
rationalize or justify your beliefs, then is it not though? You're just saying, well, I believe what I'm determined to believe, and I believe that my beliefs are rational, but that's also something you were determined to believe. So you could have
mhm.
non-rational beliefs, but you're still determined to believe that that's rational, whether it
well,
is or not,
well,
right?
that doesn't make sense because then we disagree about what it means to be rational and non-rational. So if what
However you
I
want to
mean
define it,
by
however you want to define it.
if I consider my activity rational and you consider it not rational, and we still referring to the same thing, then what we have is a semantic disagreement. It doesn't change what is actually happening.
We can define rationality however you want.
All
My
right, so
point is,
so go ahead.
my point is, you're going to be determined to believe your beliefs are rational or non-rational regardless of whether they are. It's kind of like this for me. Suppose you were blindfolded and I gave you a box of ping pong balls, and there's 100 ping pong balls in this box. 10 are red and 90 are white, and I blindfold you and ask you to pick out the red ones. How would you do that?
How would I distinguish red from?
If you were blindfolded, how could you only pick the red ping pong balls in the box that I gave you? Would you be
I
able to do
can't.
that? Right.
I know. I obviously I wouldn't be able to differentiate or distinguish red because there's a function of the body that isn't operates any way
Right.
it would. I
So if
mean,
you're
it
determined
also
to believe
depends.
everything, wait,
Well,
hold on.
hold on.
If you're determined to believe everything that you do, now make those ping pong balls your beliefs, and I ask you to pick out the false beliefs. Well, determinism is, in a sense, blindfolding you because you don't know whether it's rational or not. You're just going to do whatever you're determined to believe is rational,
Yeah,
whether it is or not.
then it comes down to what do I mean by okay, let's go back to the ping pong ball analogy, right? So if it is red, right, is something that my eyes will eyes see, right, do function as a function of the eyes, for example, and I impair that function, right? Then asking can you see red balls is incoherent, right? So so but however, if for example, just pick a ping pong ball up and I label that red, for
Mhm.
example, that's a coherent definition.
No, I don't think so. I don't
That's
think
my
you
point because
labeling.
okay, you know why you saying it's not a coherent different.
Because I think
definition?
you can be wrong. I think you can have a wrong definition of something.
Because you are committing yourself to a prescriptivist theory of semantics.
Should I not do
You
that?
are, n- you mean, no, it does. I'm just describing what you're doing.
But it sounds like you want to say that I shouldn't do that, which is prescriptivist.
No, I'm not saying that. I mean, I could have a preference, a deterministic preference. I could prefer that you not do this, but that doesn't mean that I am saying that you can do something that you are not already determined to do. So,
I don't know how
okay,
that's relevant.
it's relevant in the sense that whatever you do, right? Even if I say you should do X, for example, I just say, okay, you should do that, right? It doesn't change the fact that you cannot do otherwise than what you're going to do. So I could say you should do anything. It doesn't change what you are going to do. Understand? Well, when I say that, right, my point is that if me speaking influences your behavior, right, because it's causally efficacious, right, then that is already determined because all activity, even my activity and how you respond to any stimuli is all determined because it is all
Which
the
I
result
disagree,
of prior
but I know.
conditions. Okay, so let me
But
ask you a question, right?
sure.
Is any event the result of prior conditions?
Hmm.
So you believe that every activity is determined.
No,
So it's not determined by prior conditions.
you said as any event.
Sorry?
I, if I heard you correctly, you said is any event determined by prior conditions. I said yeah, but that doesn't mean every event is.
Also, you believe some events are not determined by prior conditions.
Correct.
Like what? Name an event
Me
that's not determined by prior conditions.
me choosing to lift my hand because,
So,
as I'm
so,
sure you know,
so
I
were you not
believe.
in a wait? So, do you not think you was in a state before you raised your hand?
Of course, I was.
Well, then, was that state in a condition itself?
What do you mean? But was that state in a
That
condition?
state, right? That state had conditions, right?
Sure, but it didn't determine me to lift my hand.
How do you know it didn't determine you if it followed right after those conditions? So you're just basically stipulating that it wasn't determined. How you're not proving that? You're just stipulating it.
Well, first, you're stipulating everything's causally determined. I'm
And
saying
well, you just saying it differently, right? You saying they're not. I saying they am. So how do we adjudicate between these two different opinions then? How do we prove that it wasn't determined by a prior condition?
well, I guess let's. How would we prove that it is determined by a prior condition? Maybe we can start there. How do you know
Well,
that you're?
because I would say because all activity is a state transition. So
But
that means any action is the result of the conditions of a prior state.
that doesn't follow.
How it doesn't follow? Explain.
Every state is an activity,
Every state transition is the result of the conditions of a prior state.
but that's just assuming determinism. It's
Sorry?
not. That's just assuming determinism. That doesn't.
How?
Every state is a result of a prior condition. I mean, that's just determinism.
So okay, so you're saying that the definition you don't accept the definition of activity that I'm presenting. That's what you're saying.
Activity doesn't necessitate determinism.
Wait, that's not the question I asked you, right? I'm asking you, right? Is an activity a state transition?
Sure, I'm fine
Right.
with
So
that
that
definition.
means before the transition, right, there was, right, a state that had conditions, correct?
So conditions change from one state to another. Therefore, what? It doesn't follow. Therefore, it was necessary.
Yeah, it follows that if a transition occurs,
Hmm.
right, as a result of being a state transition,
That's the
right,
part I disagree with.
then it was the conditions of the state
But how in
because
the world was it?
because
You know,
so
it
then
was a result.
so then you say that any active well then you're saying there are activities that are not caused by anything then.
Nope, not saying that.
Okay, with that. Okay, but you're not making sense. Let me explain why, right? Well, it doesn't seem like it doesn't make sense to me. And the reason why I say that is because if it is right that an activity, right, is a state transition, right, and that state had conditions, right, you have to say that those conditions, right, was not necessary for the change, for the activity, right? So So you're saying that the activity was uncaused, because
Nope.
if it was caused, it was caused by a prior state.
That is question begging determinism. You're just
How does
assuming determinism.
no? I'm not
Why
assume.
why does
Okay, so let me ask you this, right? You think states are disconnected? You think states are ontologically disconnected?
causally some are, yeah.
All right,
Like
prove
as in
disconnection.
the form of determinism,
Okay,
yes.
prove separation for me. If a wholly distinct existent, right, is separated by another, that entails an infinite dependence regress.
If I'm driving by Taco Bell and I see Taco Bell, does that necessarily cause me to get Taco Bell?
No, but that's irrelevant to the argument.
Nope. Nope.
Yeah.
Then you just proved that
No,
I can have
because
a
no, be,
state change states, and yet one is not necessarily caused by the other. Then you just give up your determinism.
no, because you're trying to say that certain stimuli will causally affect what
It,
you do, right?
it's a state. I'm in a state of seeing Taco Bell. And
Right.
if that doesn't
Right.
necessitate me getting Taco
Ye-
Bell, then you
Yeah,
just
but
proved
no,
yourself wrong.
no, because just because you see Taco Bell don't mean that you have to get Taco Bell. That doesn't follow.
Right. So then you just showed that one state
All
doesn't
that
necessitate the other.
No, that's not proving that. It doesn't prove that. That's question back again, because you're presupposing that you seeing Taco Bell means that you must go for Taco Bell if you're determined, and that doesn't follow, right? So, for
No,
example, somebody tell me for example, to go and run. Does that mean I will go and run just because they told me to do it?
no,
So
but if you
just because there's stimuli doesn't follow that there's no internal change going on. It just means that I am not doing what you probably think I should do, for example. But it doesn't mean that I'm not changing, right? So if everything is connected, right, then everything is changing, right, as a result of the conditions of every state. You understand?
I don't think this is coherent.
Okay, okay.
It's if I misunderstood you, correct me if I did.
Mhm.
You said that states are necessitate. You implied that states are necessitated by prior states, correct?
Well, states is just basically a functional distinct transition between activities, right?
But determinant,
So
you're a determinist, a strict determinist.
so
So that means
yeah,
necessarily one state is necessarily caused and determined by the previous, correct?
yes,
Just
correct.
dominoes falling.
Yeah, I mean it's actually the result of the initial conditions of the substance, right? All change, all activity is like smooth, right? What we call a state is basically just the static structural arrangement of the substance prior to a next structural change. You understand? You follow where I come
Go
from?
on.
Right. So what I'm saying is the initial conditions is the cause of every activity. It is the ultimate explanation for activity.
You're saying it's
So
the
if
first
so
cause.
yeah, so basically I'm saying that well, I wouldn't say it have multiple causes because I don't say events are disconnected. It's just one event. Everything is just changing, is a potential infinite.
Even if they're connected, they're not necessarily connected. But that's what you would have to say if you're a strict
Well
determinist.
well well, I would say they are necessarily connected because it's just one substance, it's only one ontological category. You understand? So if there's only one ontological category, there's nothing else to be separate from.
I was
So it's the state of the existent, right? Which is just the structural arrangement of the existent of the substance. But
let's
it's not like states are disconnected, because if they are disconnected, right, you encounter two problems, right? You encounter Bradley's regress, which is a infinite dependence regress, right? If they are supposedly disconnected, you have to be able to account for separation, which means you have to say either A and B are separated by C, and A and C must also be separated by something else. So you always have to either say there's a separator to separate two things, or you have to stipulate that two things are just separate, which is just
let me
a brute stipulation or
let me
special
get
pleading.
if I can get back to free will. So because I don't want to keep going
You
on
don't want to go
tangent.
on. Well, I mean, I just think that ontological separation is a very important part of this discussion as well. This is
Well,
why I
sure.
keep trying to
What
go back to it.
if you mean distinction? Yes, there are distinct things that don't all reduce to space.
Right.
But
So a
going
distinction. So a distinction is just the normalization of distinguishing. So it's a functional activity. So you just carve in reality up
so going
into.
going back to free will. So of course I would say that for there to be free will, you have to be more than something physical. There has to be something transcendent, like a soul that can act on the physical, not causally determined by the physical. Do you believe people are morally responsible for their actions?
They could be approximately held responsible, but they
How would I
wouldn't be
ask that?
ultimately responsible.
Right.
They wouldn't know people wouldn't be ultimately responsible. But
So
that doesn't mean that we cannot
so you're not
treat people
responsible for
as
your own beliefs, right?
well. I am. I am not that which is acting, right? So I'm not believing. I'm just the beliefs itself. I am the cognitive activity, the total cognitive activity.
So you used to be Pentecostal, right? When you went from
Yeah.
Pentecostal to a non-believer, however you want to categorize yourself, you became a different person? Or are you the same
No,
person? Right, then you're
I'm the
not your
same.
beliefs.
I'm
You
same
are not
person.
reducible to your beliefs.
I am the totality of the beliefs. You are trying to say I am reducible to one belief. I'm saying that beliefs are not separated.
So
I'm
then you
saying the
don't
total cognitivity is still ongoing. So I am that. That is what I am. I am the total ongoing cognitive
well
activity
well then
s-
now
since the brain developed.
this gets into much deeper metaphysical problems that I don't know if I want to go into
You
because
should, because I mean,
well,
we
here's the
already
problem it
touched
gets
the
into
surface.
because you're basically saying that okay, let's go back to the baseball game analogy. The baseball game is not the first inning or the second inning, right? It's all nine, which makes a baseball game
Oh God,
separable into temporal events. You're
that's
it seems like you're
that's
implying that you are not you're the totality of beliefs. So you don't fully exist right now because there's still tomorrow and
I already clarified that I'm not an existent. Why are we going back there?
you're saying you don't exist.
This is like an appeal to common sense here. What I'm trying to say,
Is that bad
right,
to
is that
appeal to common sense?
what I say common sense was common to people who already think what you think, right?
Or people
People
I
tend
think it's
to
self
think they are existence. I'm saying that we are not substances. So if only a substance exists and we are not substances, right? Then it follows that we do not exist. That is just logically valid.
you don't you don't believe you exist.
We just went over this.
It's
I
a
am the
yes or no.
cognitive. I am the cognitive activity of an existent of
Just
space.
give me a yes or no. Do you exist?
No,
Corie?
that's an appeal to ridicule, though. That's an appeal to
No, I
ridicule.
did. I okay. I apologize for laughing. I wasn't ridiculing,
That's
but
basically what you're doing.
Corie, my dude, you
You have to
don't.
admit that's what you're doing, right?
Who is denying? Who's the one denying that you don't exist?
Who?
Yeah, who's
Well,
denying?
I am a subject. I am the cognitive
I. You
activity.
just said
But
I,
I am not. But
but you
I
don't
am
exist.
not the one acting.
How can something that doesn't exist deny itself?
You're not listening to me. I'm saying that I am the cognitive activity. I am the activity itself, right?
But you're telling
I am the
me
cognitive activity itself. The
you
substance is the existent. So I am not the existent. So I am not denying. I am not that which is acting. You follow? I think if I slow it down a little bit, it'd make a little more sense there.
I think it's absurd
Why? Why I think it's absurd? You didn't show any
because you
incoherence.
are saying I don't believe that I exist. That's self defeating.
I am not an existent. So what you're doing in that argument is saying that
I'm
if
not
we
even making an
lose,
argument, Corie. I'm just repeating what you're saying. You're
no, you're
saying
not
I
repeating what
believe
you're
that I
saying.
do not exist. That's not an argument. That's just rephrasing what you said. If you think your own words are an argument against your view, then I think that's telling.
No, I'm saying that the I is a self-referential cognitive activity, is recursive.
But there is
So
no
I
self
am
in
the
your view.
activity itself. So just because I say I act doesn't entail that I am the substrate that acts. It's a colloquialism. Understand?
I under
I am the cognitive activity. I self-identify with the activity that is happening. It's the substance that is carrying out the activity.
but note how you can't even use language to describe it. You have to use
I am using the
fictional.
language. I am
You
using
said
the
colloquial. In other
language.
words, you don't believe that there's an I, correct? You don't believe that there's a self.
No, I'm telling you what the self is. I just told you what the self is. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to equivocate between real and existent. That's
There
what
is
you're
no.
doing.
No, I think you're making a false distinction there. I don't see
It
how.
has nothing like a true or false distinction. It is either coherent or incoherent.
Yeah. Oh my God. So wait. So you're telling me. So what I just said,
I could
was I
distinguish.
correct?
I could
Was I correct?
distinguish between two things,
You're saying
or
what I
you
just
could.
said was wrong?
Sorry,
Is what I just said incorrect? Is that what you're accusing me of? Which
did
is
I say
fine.
that? No, I didn't
I'm
say that.
asking,
I said
is
you're
that what you're saying?
equivocating. I'm saying
Is
you're
that
equivocating.
which means I was wrong?
I'm saying that in my framework, right?
I was wrong.
There is a distinction.
So I
You
was
understand?
wrong about your framework. Yeah, correct?
Well, obviously you didn't get you're not correctly identifying what I believe, basically.
Right. So then there can be things that are true or false, correct?
Propositions are true or false, they're cognitive evaluations.
Okay. So then why are you just focusing on coherence? So something, so 'cause you said
I
there
don't
are no
understand.
true or false, it's just coherent or incoherent.
Yeah,
Something can be
distinctions.
coherent and still false.
Sorry?
Something
With
can be,
coherence is not something can be coherent and still false, is what you're saying?
mhm.
Yeah, I
An
agree.
idea can be coherent and still false.
I mean, yeah, proposition can be coherent and still false. I don't understand what.
So then why are you putting so much weight on coherence? And then it sounded like you were denying,
Because
you said,
what I'm saying is just because something can be coherent and false doesn't entail that a distinction is true or false. Understand? Or necessarily true or
I
false.
don't understand.
But it doesn't follow that a distinction is necessarily true or false just because um, what you could say about the proposition, for example, is that this distinction I am making refers to this. Is that true or false? Right? Because now it's a proposition. But if I just make a distinction between, for example, material and immaterial, that's not something that can be true or false, right? That's just a distinction. It's just a negation of the other. I'm referring to material and I'm saying immaterial is not material. So that's a distinction. It's not something that can be true or false.
Okay.
Explain to me how that distinction is true or false.
Because you can be incorrect in your distinctions.
But that's something completely different from what we're saying. I'm asking how does the distinction itself be true or false? I'm not asking if the can we be true or false and how we make the distinction. I am saying that the distinction true material and immaterial, right? What about that is true or false? The distinction itself, the distinction material and immaterial. What is true or false about that?
Whether or not it's a true dichotomy.
Yeah, but
That could be true or false.
what it is a true dichotomy. I don't understand. Yeah.
I agree.
If I'm
Right. So it's
distinguishing,
true. That
right?
distinction is true. Yeah.
Right, but now you're asking a different question. Is it a true dichotomy? That's a proposition. That's not the distinction itself. You're conflating the two. You're conflating the proposition with the distinction. You understand? If I distinguish between um you and me, right? Is that true or false? Is you would say it's true or
Mm-hmm.
false if I'm making a false dichotomy, right?
Yes.
Right? But how is it a true or false dichotomy? Explain.
In other words, if I say it's either A or B, that's a distinction, but that could be a
Mhm.
false dichotomy.
How is it a false dichotomy?
I could say Korea is either
It,
a
it,
Christian or a Muslim.
mhm.
Well, that's a false dichotomy. Those aren't the exhaustive options. So that distinction between those are the only things you can be would be false distinction.
Well, right, but that's a different proposition. You're talking about all the things that you could possibly be. If you're distinguishing between two things out of many other things, right?
I'm gonna
Obviously,
before you finish your statement. If there's any questions for me or Corey, I've seen some. Type question, and I would love to hear what question you have for Corey, so we can begin to wrap up. But go ahead, Corey. Go
how much
ahead and
viewers
finish
do you
yours.
have anyway? Because I feel like it's just two of us.
How many what?
How many viewers we have?
Total. I'll have to look up the total. Right now, we have quite a few people in the chat here.
Everybody
Um,
probably like he doesn't believe he exists.
well, I mean, can you
I
blame
mean, it
them?
is. It is. No, I can't blame them because I and all used to. When I first looked at monism, right? I find it was very radical. It's a very radical position, and I went from Spinoza, um, from
I
like
thought you
I
went to
used to, so
Spinoza.
because I used to be like a pantheist first. When I transitioned from Pentecostal to atheist, then I went agnostic, then I went back to agnostic atheist, then I went to pantheist, then I went to Pyrrhonian skepticism, and then from Pyrrhonian skepticism, I tried to avoid um, such an extreme. And I wanted to determine whether or not I could be certain of anything, and I was able to hold on to foundationalism, so which I call non-inferential foundationalism, and a lot of people probably familiar with it. So I would hold to non-inferential foundationalism, and in relation to the problem of the criterion, I would hold to epistemic methodism, because I believe that experiences is prior to knowing and prior to justifying. So I believe you need to distinguish um, X from Y or this from that before you could actually know anything. So I would say that distinguishing is the method is basically the sufficient necessary conditions for knowledge. So when I say basically that act have to occur for knowledge. So so yeah, basically what I'm trying to say is that yes, I understand that existence monism is very radical. However, when you look into relations, for example, Aristotle relations, who decided to carve reality up into relations and properties and particulars and universes and stuff like that. You encounter metaphysics such as Spinoza and his neutral monism and substance monism, and then you get into Bradley, F.H. Bradley, who actually was an idealist. So when you
Can
look
I
into
let me interject here though, because I
on a rant,
no, it's all right.
uh-huh.
You began by talking, and even in our email exchange, you said if something is incoherent, it can't be true, right? Or I don't remember this
Yeah,
now,
if
but
yeah, of course, if it's incoherent, like a statement, for
so how
example,
is it?
a statement could be incoherent and not true or false.
No, but like you use coherence as a high standard for believing something. It seems
Yeah,
right.
something have to be current before it could be considered true or false.
And how in the world then is it coherent in your view to say I believe that I do not exist?
I just explained already. So I is a recursively self-referential pattern of cognitive activity.
But you're saying
So
self-referential means that there
so that
is
means
a
I
self
am
to refer to.
so I am self-associating with the believing, right, in a proposition, right?
I,
That
I.
the I does not refer to an existent. It does not refer to the substance. In the same way, you will say the soul does not refer to matter, or it does not refer to that which is spatial. It's the same move. It's the same dialectical move you could make. It is coherent. There's nothing
Okay.
incoherent about that.
Let's go with some questions. And again, if you have questions, throw them up there. Here's a
Wait, wait,
question from.
wait. Oh, sorry.
Go
Go ahead.
ahead. Go ahead.
No, is it no? What was the question?
Is it true that coherent concepts are an acceptable way to evaluate reality?
Um, so there could be internal coherence, right? But you have to ground the concepts first, right? So it depends on how you fix it in meaning. For example, there are different types of definitions, right? You have ostensive definitions, and then you have non-ostensive definitions. So a non-ostensive definition, right, can be stipulated as meaningful. You could presuppose that this concept is meaningful, for example, when it could just be gibberish, right? So, um, a coherent concept, you need to determine how that concept is coherent first, right? And if it could only be coherent if it's grounded in something spatial, for example, right? If space is the necessary conditions for coherence, right? For example, right? Then yes, a coherent concept can determine what reality is, right? So you could have, for example, let's say for example the non-spatial, right? I see that concept as incoherent because it negates all meaningful referencing, which I would call a spatial activity, right? So let's say this activity was not spatial, right? Then it would follow that the non-spatial is coherent if it actually fixes a referent, which is the activity itself, right? So then you could say the non-spatial refers to activity, for example, right? And that would be coherent. It wouldn't just be a definition by negation, because you're also referring to something else. So you're not just saying X, you're not identifying X and saying not X is something meaningful. You're
And
saying not X refers to this by actually referring to something we could refer to, such as the activity itself.
and you don't
So
think that we should define things with like negative references?
no, I think an apophatic definition cannot itself fix meaning.
Yet you define yourself as a non-theist,
Yeah, in relation to theism.
which is defining something as a not something else.
Yeah, but I just explained that, and the negation of a definition is only meaningful if you could refer to something. So if I say a non-theist is someone who does not believe in theism, then it's a meaningful reference, because I'm
Okay.
still referring. But if non-spatial is the negation of referring completely, right? Then obviously it would be incoherent. It would be like saying the negation of all things is a thing. It will be self-defeating, right? You can't say the negation of all things is itself a thing
So,
without
and
contradicting yourself, right?
real quick, you would say that thoughts are spatially located? Yes or no?
Thoughts happen as spatial changes. So I mean,
So would that be a yes
I
or
don't know
no?
what it means to say spatially located, right?
I mean, if everything's space,
Because what I'm trying to say, space is not a container, right? I feel like that's how you define in space. So you're kind of like straw man in my definition of space, because I'm not defining space as a container, and you seem to
are
be
there
doing that.
locations? Do things have locations?
Do things have locations? A functional distinction? Yeah, you could distinguish stuff that's spatially
Do you use
um,
GPS?
related. Yeah.
Are you not going to a spatial location when you do that?
If I am going to a spatial location,
Mm-hmm.
well, the spatial form is just in a different location. Yeah, you could say that is just just a different spatial arrangement. It's still space. It's like there's nowhere where there is not space. You understand? So it's like
So there are
I am the
spatial
activity. So
locations.
wherever the activity happens, right? You can say I am there, right?
Okay, I feel
Wherever
like
the activity happens.
you take a simple question and you overly complicate it and don't really answer the
Because
question.
it's not a simple question. That's why
Okay,
I need to
let's go
qualify
to some
the question.
questions here. So here's another question. Corie, what's the difference between an okay, never mind. Sorry.
A orange, a bicycle seat. What?
Because a
Okay.
snake has no arms.
Okay, let's just take the first question.
Okay, here we go. Would
the difference
Corie
between
agree that his view is incoherent? Why not?
Would Corey agree that his view is incoherent? No, I believe my view is coherent.
Why do you not agree? Why do you think it is? Why would you disagree that it's
Because
incoherent?
what I consider coherent is being able to meaningfully reference exactly what I am distinguishing. So my terms, if it's ostensibly grounded, right, then they can be meaningful, right? And we are also acting within a semantic framework. So we're using lexical definitions, and we are able to discuss these ideas. I mean, if my view isn't incoherent, then you wouldn't even know what I'm talking about, right? But we're using the same language.
I don't agree.
What you don't agree with?
I think I can understand what your view is and say it's incoherent.
And I believe your view is incoherent. I already I mean, you didn't demonstrate any
No, in other words,
incoherence.
I can understand a view because you said if my view is incoherent, you couldn't understand it. I disagree with that statement. I think you can understand a view and think
You
it's
can't
incoherent.
understand something that's incoherent. That just doesn't make sense. That's a contradiction.
So
How
did
can
I
you
just
understand
listen?
something that's incoherent? Explain that.
So is what I just said? Is that incoherent?
No, what you said is not incoherent, but I'm asking you, how do you, right?
If
How do
someone
you
said,
understand something that is incoherent? You could say something is incoherent as in you don't understand it. You're saying that you don't understand it because it's incoherent.
if I say
But
there
then,
is no
but that
truth, that's self-defeating. It's incoherent, but I understand what the person's saying. Or if
No,
I say that
no,
I
you need to
believe I don't exist,
clarify
but it's
because
let's
because you're presupposing that we both have the same understanding of what the term truth is.
okay. Let me go
No,
to this.
but you agree that truth have different definitions, right? Yes or no? I know this is probably hard for you because you never had a
No, I
conversation
don't.
with
I don't think
somebody
it's.
with these views.
I think it's, and I say this as respectfully as possible. I just think it's absurd what you're saying. I think
I
it's
mean, I
contradictory.
would think it's absurd to think otherwise. But
Here's the next question. Who or what is experiencing? How can you say I have experiences? Wouldn't you have to say space has experiences?
yeah, space is the one experiencing, but I am the experience. So I identify with the experience itself. You understand?
I
So
don't, but I'm
I
gonna
so
keep
I
going with
am
the
not
questions.
so I am not that which is experiencing. This the substance that has taken this form, right, is what is experiencing, right? It is what is changing. But I am the experience itself. I am the cognitive activity. If your cognitive activity ceases, then basically you're functionally dead as far as everybody understands, right? Unless of course you presuppose a soul. But um especially within biology and stuff like that, normally we consider somebody dead when their brain stops function, which is basically the cessation of cognitive activity. So you no longer say that person is still with us, right? You would say that person is dead because they are no longer there to refer to themselves, to engage in meaningful activity that we could say, all right, this is him or he's a different person, because there's no more cognitive activity happening. How does he know that he doesn't exist? Because how I define what an existence is. An existence is a substrate, right? And I refer to the cognitive activity as myself, as me, right? I am cognitive activity. And if activity isn't an existence, isn't a substance, if an activity isn't a substance, and I am an activity, then it follows that I am not an existence. I do not exist. So it sounds absurd, do I understand? But it's logically valid. Think about it. If an activity is what an existent does, and I am an activity, which are cognitive activity of this spatial form, then I am not the substrate. You understand? I'm not the substance. So what I'm arguing is everything that you could see around you, whatever, for example, right, is basically spatial. There's no separation between anything, right? Because there's a problem with separation, right? The reason, so if you look into like Bradley, F.H. Bradley, you would understand the problem with separating. What we
And
are
just
doing is
be brief on
distinguishing.
this. Be brief on it because I want to go to the next one. But
Oh
I want to
yeah.
let you finish. Go
So
ahead.
wait, let me just see what else he said here. I'm confused. So at this point, he's arguing with nothingness.
In other words, if you and
No,
I don't
no,
exist,
no, 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 no. I'm not arguing because
because there is
obviously
no
that
I.
presupposes of no, no. I'm not saying that there is no I. I'm saying that I am not the substance. The substance is arguing, right? The substance is changing, right? Is doing all the activities at once, right? But but there's no such thing as nothingness because nothingness is just the negation of all things that you can refer to, right? So what is happening is there are two different spatial activities happening, right? There's the spatial activity, your cognitive activity that you call Eric, right? That you consider Eric. You call that cognitive activity
I
Eric.
no, I don't call my cognitive activity Eric. I call me the self Eric. I am a
And
immaterial
well,
substance,
right.
and I have thoughts.
Well, I
I'm
know
the one
that's what you
possessing the
believe.
thoughts.
Well, I know
Right.
that's what you believe, but we disagree on that, right?
Well, you said I call my cognitive activity Eric. I'm just saying no. I don't hold to
No,
that.
well, I'm just saying from within my framework,
Okay.
you, you will consider you will you would consider yourself the material substance. What I consider cognitive activity. That's what I'm saying. I'm not trying to
Do you
straw man you.
exist when you're in a coma? Well, I guess you don't believe you exist to begin with.
What? No, you don't accept. Okay, but I think I understand what the person trying to get. So there's still the capacity for the cognitive activity, the pattern of cognitive activity to occur. So you can be in a coma, right? But the structures are still there. That 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 could allow for the pattern of cognitive activity to continue or to restart. So in that sense, you could be in a coma and well, it's not you in a coma, right? The body could be in a coma
So
state.
you're not your your cognitive activity then, because if you
Sorry?
can exist, you're not your cognitive activity. If you can exist while in a coma and yet there's no cognitive activity,
No, I
then you
didn't say
can't.
that. No, I'm not saying you exist. I never said you exist at all. Those words, I never use those words, right? The body, the spatial body, still has the structure to exhibit the cognitive activity, even if it's in a coma state, right? So, what we do as a society is we try to preserve that spatial form because it still has the capacity and potential for that cognitive activity to reoccur. Understand?
Yeah, and I have like a few more questions, by the way.
Yeah, no problems.
Okay. Does he only
Does he
believe in
believe in
internal coherence, or did he think that his position had to be coherent with reality? Good
Does he
question.
only believe in internal coherence? No, so that's exactly what I was arguing against, right? I was saying that how a definition must be ostensibly grounded. Because, example, you stipulate a soul is an existent, right? But if you don't tell me what an existent is,
I did tell you.
or what a, I'm just saying, it's a hypothetical, right?
Okay.
So if it is, you didn't say what an existent is, right? Or what a soul is, right? You just exhibiting an identity relationship. It would be semantic bootstrapping. Basically, it would be a stipulative definition that doesn't fix reference conditions for it to be meaningful. So within your semantic framework, it could be internally coherent. Just like, for example, AI or ChatGPT, for
But
example.
but to be brief though, so you are, but your answer here is no. You don't think it's only internal
You find
coherence,
out I'm being too
right?
long. You're giving long answers.
Yeah, which is interesting though because, gosh, I don't want to go
I
back
mean,
to that because
in philosophy, you can't just take things so lightly because it have a lot of metaphysics and things that's baked into these questions that you really need to teed out.
so a belief has to not only be coherent to be true, it also has to match with reality, correct?
Um, well, under correspondence theory of truth, yeah, I would say yes.
Okay. Other question: if the soul isn't real, what exactly is the you experiencing your thoughts and emotions right now?
All right, so the soul is just the reification of um, cognitive activity. It's basically saying that the mind, well, it's basically treating the soul like the mind in a sense. So it's saying like the cognitive activity, you give it a noun and you call it mind, and you say that what possesses the mind is a soul, right? So what you're doing is you're giving a functional definition, which means that that which grounds mind, which is the nominalization of cognitive activity, is what I consider an existent, right? So is a fallacy. The fallacy is called hypostatization. You need to look into that. It was actually since Plato days, and that's how this whole um, transcendental fallacious reasoning occurred. It occurred since Plato days. So, which is called Platonism, and a lot of people in society already treat Platonism as like acceptable around. And I'm a strict nominalist, so I don't treat the nominalization of verbs or actions as existence. So, not to take too long again, if the soul isn't real, what exactly is the you experiencing? Well, that's a loaded question, right? Because by asking, by saying you experience, in a sense, you're trying to say I am the substance that is undergoing the activity called experiencing, right? And what I'm arguing is that I am the cognitive activity. I am an experience. So an experience is just the normalization of experiencing. It's just we carving up an ongoing activity into different discrete in discrete parts. So we will call like this ongoing activity. We will cut it up and say this event followed by this event followed by this event, right? But it's really just a conceptual abstraction as what we're doing.
All right,
So,
10 more seconds and I'll let you finish. And then for the rest, we
oh
have to be
jeez,
quicker in the answer.
I'll try and be quick. Yeah.
And then
So
here, I'm going to put up the next question for you. Go ahead and finish this one. I'm going to put up the next question. I'll be right back.
yeah. So question, Corey, is it possible for you to die? Um. Well, yeah. If the cognitive activity ceases, then there's no longer me. So yeah, when cognitive activity ceases, there's no I again. Okay, now I'm just by myself. Any other questions, guys? I know it's very esoteric, um, but I'm open to any questions. Unfortunately, I can't see them in this private chat. Oh, okay, I think I see them now. The mental gymnastics with this one is strong. Yeah, I know it sounds like mental gymnastics. Corey, is activity dependent on the substance? Yes, it is, because the substance is what grounds the activity. And by that I mean the substance is that which is acting. If so, then you would exist, because to exist means to stand out of non-being. To exist means to stand out. So you mean, so to be a non-substance is to be, so you're trying to say the activity of an existent is an existent itself? I think that's what you're trying to say. I would deny that. I would not reify the activity of an existent. I would say activity is just what the existent does. I wouldn't say the activity is itself a separated existent. Oh,
Okay.
thanks, Brando. I appreciate that, man. They are a bit crazy because they're not popular. But trust me, I went through a lot of philosophy to come to this position. If you're interested in some of the arguments against ontological pluralism, you could look into F.H. Bradley, or you could even look into um, the Parmenian Ascent. Um, that's a good book, paper on why existence monism is justifiable.
Someone said Corey is far too intelligent for Eric, and the irony is they misspelled too.
What's the irony? Oh, the irony is that
They
my
misspelled
basic
too.
current. Oh,
Corey is far too
oh
T-O.
yeah, they didn't put TO.
Right.
Yeah, that's
Can Corey please clearly explain space-time medium? A space isn't a container; it's a womb.
so
Uh,
womb.
give
Okay,
a
I'm not sure about
30
that, but
second,
I think you're talking
30
about
seconds.
right. So space time is basically like a model Einstein came up with. Is basically accounting for change in space, the change of spatial objects, so forms and stuff like that. So what they did is they collapse two distinct things: space and time. Space I would call a substance, time I would call the change of the substance, and they collapsed it so that they could account for the transition of spatial objects, right? So they would plot a graph basically, and they would have obviously one axis time, one axis space, and they would just try to account for change of spatial objects basically. But what happens is they end up collapsing state with temporal point. So you cannot distinguish between a moment and a state in a space-time ontology, right? So basically, is reification again. They reify in a model. So the model is just what the physicists came up with to try and explain change within the universe. Let me see. What
All right.
humans
So
have always observed matter existing.
here's Brando said, in order to recognize something is incoherent, you have to first understand it. Slam
No,
says,
not necessarily. You could identify symbols, but that means you have to understand what these symbols refer to.
okay.
So these symbols don't necessarily have to be coherent if you don't understand what these symbols refer to. So if I type gibberish right now, right, would that be coherent? You would know what I mean by the symbols. You would just be able to identify the symbols, right? Because they're spatially differentiated. You could say that
Okay.
A is separate from B or C is separate from C.
Did you already
If they
answer
had
this one?
so
So things
things
do
do
not exist
not
if not observed by
exist.
humans? Or maybe she was, okay, she was
Right,
asking
right.
someone
So
else.
okay, I think that's a good argument. A good question, sorry. So I would say that an existent is that which grounds the activity, the cognitive activity, such as observing. So the observing is itself an activity, and we could conclude from activity that there is something that grounds the activity, right? So what I'm saying is that if there is activity, what we could conclude from this is that there's a state transition, which means there's a differentiation, a structural differentiation between identifying this from that. So if you're distinguishing, right, in some sense you already have an extended feel, right, that you're separating things, right? It's not just a process. So either you collapse the ontology into a process ontology by saying all distinctions is just a cognitive activity, right? Or you say that there is actual extension and we are distinguishing within that extended field.
10 seconds.
Yeah, sorry, I know my answer is wrong.
Yes, a little bit.
Sorry about that.
How does space categorize you as the experience with thoughts that are yours, what is the prioritizing of ideas in space?
I do think what is doing the prioritizing of ideas. So I think that all change is just determine consequences of initial conditions. So prioritizing, I would say, is just an inevitability of unfolding change. Okay, next question. Which particular book from Bradley is he referring to? No, I'm talking about Parmenion Ascent, but with Bradley, F.H. Bradley, that would be um is it Being and Appearances? Or Appearances and Being. I think that's the name of that one. You could look into that one by
Corey, this is just a
Bradley.
statement. Corey, I think you're a cool dude. I think your ideas are crazy, but I think you're all right.
Yeah, same here, Eric, man. I really I like how you conduct yourself, man. Yeah,
Oh, thank
kudos to
you.
that. Yeah.
And that was Brando. Okay, so
I
Edwin
answered
is
that question
saying,
already.
yeah,
Activity is dependent on the substance, correct? Because activity is what the substance does. If so, then you would exist because to exist mean. Oh, I think I saw this statement already. So they're saying I exist, which is already a straw man, because to exist means to stand out of non-being. Well, what is non-being? You're just negating the substance, right? But if you're still referring to something such as the activity, then the activity is not the being, right? The activity is what the being does. So there's a distinction in philosophy that they make between being and becoming. Becoming is change. They don't treat becoming like being. So becoming is basically activity, is basically change, is basically time. Cosmic time, not the operational definition of time. So you can look into those distinctions as well, if you're interested.
and I think, and
So your
that's
space doesn't exist. Well, the substance that is undergoing the activity is what I call space.
all right. So, Corey, thanks for being here. I would,
Eric, go, are you going already?
yeah,
I was
it's,
having fun, man. I know you wasn't having much fun, but yeah.
but no, but I really do thank you for coming on. I thank you for being transparent and sharing your views, or maybe
Yeah.
not your views since you don't exist. The views of space that see, it's wild to me. Um,
Well, I
I
mean,
would,
I could associate myself with those views. I mean, it does follow that I have to exist.
okay.
But
So
don't
now
worry,
you just
don't worry,
changed. Okay,
but don't-
so I would highly. I know you said you used to be Pentecostal. I would highly encourage you to reassess your views. I want them to match reality. As someone who professes at one point to be Christian, I'd like to remind you that if there is no God, there are many things that we can't have that wouldn't
like
exist,
what?
which
Wait, maybe we
I
can
don't
have
want to
like
get
what?
into. I don't want to get into a
Okay,
whole
wait. I just
discussion.
you have to go. I just want to say something real quick though.
Go ahead.
All right. So on my view, I believe in an eternal recurrence. Something that Friedrich Nietzsche um pushed. So in that sense, I don't believe that when we die or the cognitive activity ceases, that it wouldn't repeat. So in a sense, that's kind of like my heaven. You know what I mean? Because I get to experience exactly what's these experiences. Um, and the reason I believe that is because I believe the substrate is unbounded, is finite in extent and volume, and I believe it transitions from a homogeneous state to non-homogeneous structures, and then it will go back to a homogeneous state and start all over. So,
So, like a reincarnation,
um, in a sense, yeah, we will just repeat the same activity.
Corey, my dude.
Yeah. Still, I mean, it follows because if you look into the Poincare recurrence theorem, is actually proven in physics. So you can look into the Poincare recurrence theorem, and it states that if the universe is closed, which I believe it is, because it cannot be extended infinitely, um, then you would have eternal recurrence as a metaphysical
So
necessity.
let's not bring up any other categories because I'm gonna be tempted to jump in them. I just wanted to finish by
But
saying,
we should have like a formal debate or something like that. I know this is real informal, and I really appreciate you having me on. I think it would be real good to actually have something formal.
okay, it, possibly if maybe
Sounds
we could
like
do it
hell
on a
to me.
third party channel. I just think your views are so
That's funny.
wild, and I think there's a lot of mental
I mean,
gymnastics to
I
avoid
don't think
God, and I
I don't
just
think I'm
let it.
the only person who has these views, though. I mean, if you
It's
look
okay that
into,
doesn't make a difference. Popularity, right? Popularity doesn't win truth. I would just like to remind you,
well, I'm
and of
not
course,
saying it's truth. I'm just saying
I
it's coherent.
Oh my gosh, Corie, you're doing it again. Not that it's bad, but just like you keep bringing up new things. It's like if it's not true but coherent, gosh, I want to believe true things. I want to avoid false things. I want to remind you that, as you know, if Christianity is true, there's a heaven, there's a hell. If Christianity is true, there's a God who loves you.
Well, I think
That we were
that's
separated.
incoherent.
Well,
Okay, let me ask you this
let me
question.
no, hold on. Let me finish my statement.
All right.
I just want to remind you that if Christianity is true, there's a God who loves you. There's a heaven and hell. He sent his son to die so that we could be reconciled to him, back to fellowship. And I think that if in order to avoid that, you have to go to conclusions like there is no mind or consciousness, there is no self, that space is what is
There
thinking,
is a self.
that you don't exist, however you want to phrase that, that it doesn't, it's coherent and necessarily true. I pray that the Holy Spirit gets you to rethink these things or help you rethink these things, because I think this is very, very much ad hoc. But I want to give you the last word, and I want to ask, like I've asked my guests in the past, do you mind if I closed out in prayer after you say your last words?
You could propose in prayer, but I'll just leave. But I appreciate the kind thought though. As I said, I don't think it's meaningful to me. But could I say something? And I mean, I really want to discuss more with you, but it's sounding like you're trying to wrap up.
Yeah, because we've been going for almost 2 hours.
Oh, 2 hours now?
Yeah.
I lose track of time. No change. So yeah, I just want to say that anybody who really interested in why I have these views, you could probably look into strict nominalism. You could look into functionalism. You could look into F.H. Bradley on relations. You could look into well, um, emergence if it contradicts the law of identity or ex nihilo nihil fit. You can look into constraints necessary for meaning. And you can look into theological non-cognitivism. I think that's the best one because a lot of people think that is a dichotomy between atheists and theists, in a sense that people think that if you're not a Christian or a theist, then you're automatically an atheist, and that doesn't follow. There is theological non-cognitivism, and I think a lot of people should look into that. So, if you have children, they don't exist. They are cognitive activities as well of space.
So,
yeah.
What was your answer to me, Praying, closing out?
Oh yeah, I appreciate the thought and stuff like that, but I don't want to endorse something that I just don't think is coherent.
Well, you don't exist, so it's okay. You won't be endorsing anything because there's no I to endorse it. But
yeah, well, I mean, it's still views, and I'm still the experience and the views of space. So
okay,
and I guess determined in that sense. But I appreciate the thought, Garrick, and I feel like we should have this conversation again.
Yeah, if someone wants to set up that way, it could be like on a third-party platform. If you want to have a formal debate, we can look into that.
Yeah, that sounds real good. I'm all game.
All right. Well, thanks again then for coming on. I appreciate that. Thank you guys for watching. Yeah, I'll be keeping you in my prayers, Corie, and I pray that everyone else on here do the same for him. Thank you guys.
All right. Later.
All right. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.